4.1 Ethical, legal and health and safety issues in S and SES research. Key terms and background. Ethical means the moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or conducting of an activity. Legal means working within the boundaries of civil law. And health and safety means regulations and procedures intended to prevent accident or injury in workplaces or public environments. The Nazis are the reason for the creation of the Nuremberg Code because during World War II they did many experiments on people who were against Hitler's beliefs, these being mainly the Jews. The experiments were against their will and they weren't treated very well. The Nuremberg Code is a set of research ethic principles for human experimentation created as a result of the Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War. The code consists of 1. Voluntary human consent is essential. 2. Experimental results should be good results for society. 3. Anticipated results should justify the experiment. 4. Avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering. 5. No experiment if there is a chance of death or disability. 6. Minimize risk of subjects. 7. Proper preparations and facilities to protect subjects. 8. Experiments conducted only by qualified persons. 9. Subject can withdraw at any time. 10. Terminate experiment if results are known or with best judgment. The Declaration of Helsinki is a set of ethical principles regarding human experimentation developed from the medical community by the World Medical Association (WMA). Basis: British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. Produce a code of conduct for sports science practitioners and researchers. It outlines ethical and legal issues and health and safety guidelines. Scenario 1. Scenario 1 Evaluation. So, good practice was the informed consent. Informed consent is permission granted in full knowledge of the possible consequences. If the participant is under the age of 18, they must get consent from an adult, preferably by a parent or guardian. The participants have been given permission by their parents, as they range from 10 to 16 years old, to go on a trip, including doing some of the tests. Poor practice. Right to withdraw. Giving participants the right to withdraw does not just informing them that they can leave the study at any time, but it's also informing them that they have the right to withdraw their results from the study at any time. Before the test takes place, the participant must be told that they can withdraw at any time during their test and withdraw their data if they wish to do so after the test as well. If you want to give the participant the right to withdraw, it could affect them negatively psychologically and physically. This is because they might feel less confident than others to be tested with the amount of fat on their bodies, which can affect them psychologically, e.g. knocking their confidence. Depending on the circumstance, if you don't give someone the right to withdraw, there are a range of consequences that can affect the researcher. They could receive ethical training, a formal reprimand, or possibly within future experiments they would have to be supervised. To avoid this, when the participant does not want to do something, the researcher needs to accept their choice of withdrawing. However, as there only may be a couple of people withdrawing, the researcher can carry on with the test with the remainder of the participants. Confidentiality. Confidentiality is a part of ethical guidelines of psychologists and means that information between a patient and a therapist cannot be shared with anyone. This applies to patients and any health professional, including doctors and nurses. Confidentiality is part of the Data Protection Act 1988. This means that it is the law to keep information on a participant safe. If the information was on a computer or laptop, the device must be password protected, or if the information was on paper, it must be locked away. If information was to be shared and the participant found out, it could have a negative psychological effect on them. For example, with the data being put on the board with everyone to see, some participants may feel embarrassed with their results, which could give them anxiety and knock their confidence. Depending on the information, the consequences could vary on the information that is shared. For example, with this data, the researcher could just be given a formal reprimand, whereas if it was personal information like bank details, they could end up in prison or with a fine to pay off. They would also receive bad publicity for sharing data with others. This could affect them having future participants. To avoid this, the researchers should keep the results to themselves and ask permission of the participants if they can share the results with their coach. Informed consent example. Scenario 2 evaluation. I couldn't find any good practice in this scenario. However, poor practice, I'd say respect. It is having the regard for somebody's feelings, wishes, or rights. When carrying out an experiment, you would need to realize that some people will not want to do certain things. This means that the researcher would have to respect their wishes, similarly letting someone have the right to withdraw. By not giving them the respect the participant deserves, it can affect them negatively in a psychological way, e.g., making them feel like they don't matter. Depending on the circumstances, if you don't give the participant respect, there are a range of consequences that can affect the researcher. They could receive ethical training, a formal reprimand from a high authority, or possibly have future experiments supervised. To avoid this, the researcher must give equal respect to every participant and respect that some people won't be willing to do everything. First aid. First aid is help given to a sick or injured person until full medical treatment is available. Before carrying out an experiment, the researcher must know where the closest first aid kit is and the closest first aider if the researcher is not qualified. They must also have a phone to be able to contact emergency services or know the closest one. If you did not know this information, there would be a negative physical effects on the participant as they wouldn't receive the correct or any first aid required for the injury that they sustain. There's also a chance that it could affect them psychologically as well, depending on the severity of the injury. Depending on the circumstances, if you don't give the participant first aid, there are a range of consequences that can affect the researcher. The researcher in this case would receive suspension, first aid training, or possibly have future experience supervised due to not knowing this information as they put the participants at risk. Scenario 3 of my own. At the end of the day, you come up with a later date to do a blood lactate test. All the participants agree to do this and you book in the session. However, you only choose the participants with the lowest BMIs. Later on in the day, you write up a risk assessment. It's the day for the test and the Institutional Ethics and Review Committee have not given ethical clearance, but you still carry on with the test. Right, scenario 3 evaluation. Good practice. It was a risk assessment. Risk assessment is a systematic process of evaluating the potential risks that may be involved in a project, activity, or undertaking. A risk assessment must be updated every time when a new piece of equipment is used within the situation, so therefore to reduce the chance of harm. Poor practice. Equality and impartiality is decision making based on an objective criteria rather than being biased, prejudiced, or having a preference over somebody else for an improper reason. By not having equality and impartiality within the experiment, it can affect the participants who are not chosen negatively, as they might feel embarrassed as they weren't chosen because of their BMIs were the highest of the group, possibly classing them as overweight. Depending on the circumstances, if you don't give the participants equality and impartiality, there are a range of consequences that can affect the researcher. This could end up with the researcher with bad publicity and ethical training, as they chose the slimmer participants to complete the experiment when there was no need. What the researcher should have done is used everybody rather than a select few to do the test, so not to make the ones not chosen feel left out because of their BMI scores. Ethical clearance. It is comparing the ethical positives and negatives of an experiment to whether or not it could be carried out to be a fair one. By not having ethical clearance before the experiment, there is a high chance of there being a negative impact on the participants negatively, physically and psychologically. This is because the experiment was not given the ethical clearance for a reason, so the effects could vary on what happens to the participants. Depending on the circumstances, if you don't have ethical clearance, there are a range of consequences that can affect the researcher. This could end up with the researcher having ethical training, supervised future experiments, or suspension, depending on what happened in the experiment, as participant or the participants might have got lucky and not suffered any injuries, so the researcher would not possibly have as bad as a punishment, whereas if they did suffer injuries, the punishment might be a lot severe. This is a risk assessment example of what could happen, of the hazards, people at risk, controls to be put in place, likelihood, outcome, risk rating, and actions necessary.